Hello, I'm Carl Raschke, and welcome to the Whitestone Foundation's symposium on the existential crisis of learning and the future of the knowledge society. I'm here with a number of distinguished guests, thought leaders in their own right, and people who are actually from all over the world, Europe, New Zealand, the United States. And so we do have a global range of expertise that's going to be talking here tonight. So without much ado, I'm going to get into the conversation. We're going to start. Each of our panelists will start off with a 5-minute statement answering a number of questions in response to the title and the various prompts they've been giving, and then we will have a kind of free-flowing, broad-ranging discussion afterwards, back and forth, to see if we can kind of make these issues really come alive, not only for us, but also for our audience. So I'm going to start with Erik Smith. And would each of you, when you start talking, could you say your name? And could you also just tell us your affiliation?
Well, I am Eric Smith. I'm a research fellow at the Cato Institute. Hi. Hi. I'm on a webinar. Thank you. I knew that was going to happen. Um, so I'm going to start over now.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
Yes, I'm Eric Smith, research fellow at the Cato Institute. And I am in the vertical of politics and society. I do issues with civil discourse, and I study the culture war, if you will.
Oh,
And I'm here today and interested today because as a rhetorician, I think rhetoric is a huge part of what I'm calling the knowledge economy, which is not just about material production, but the production of value, right? And meaning. And those things are negotiated socially. I think somebody here is going to be talking about like emergent wild learning and things like that, and I'm on board with that kind of idea. But to preface what I'm going to say, I want to reference the rhetorician and philosopher Kenneth Burke, who came up with a metaphor called the parlor, right? The Burkean parlor is what it's called, and he was talking about the differences between disciplines, but I see it as a nice model for society and the marketplace of ideas. So let's say the world is a parlor. People are in there, they're having conversations, and you arrive. The conversation's been going on for quite some time. You can't just interject. You have to listen to figure out what people are talking about, who you agree with, who you disagree with, what information they have, what information you have that could contribute to the conversation. And when you are ready, when you have listened actively, then you enter in and participate and contribute to this conversation. Eventually, time moves on, you have to go, but that conversation's still going, right? And the next day you're gonna have to do the same thing over again. I like that idea as a description of the marketplace of ideas. We're not just speaking, yelling at each other. We're listening. We're making sure we understand what the other person or people are saying before we contribute. That's the definition of active listening, as far as I'm concerned. You make sure you understand what the other person is saying before you contribute. So I like this idea of the society as a Burkean parlor and the knowledge economy as a kind of parlor, right? I'm actually thinking of the knowledge economy as, the good old-fashioned marketplace of ideas. I am a rhetorician. My field is rhetoric and composition, and you would think we'd be primed for this kind of thing to promote civil discourse. That hasn't been happening. We've taken a turn, it's called a public turn, but it's really a turn towards social justice activism and things like that. I want to do a public return to civil discourse. And especially since writing instruction has changed a bit now that AI is in the game, right? Maybe we need to focus more on extemporaneous conversation right? Contextual conversation, understanding audiences, and understanding what's called in social linguistics, capital D discourse, which is basically the values, beliefs, and attitudes that different communities have, right? That help them see the world in different ways. If we can understand that these discourses, A, exist, and B, can be understood, then we can be more effective communicators, right? And we can produce more generative conversations and less yelling at each other or talking past each other or refusing to talk in the first place, right? So I think it's very important for us to have an education where dialogue is systemic throughout. Students aren't just learning rhetorical skills that give them the confidence to talk. They're also seeing it modeled by their professors, by their fellow students. In lieu of a monologic presentation, we have panel discussions, right? In lieu of lectures, we have, another professor come in and model a discussion about the topic, right, for the students. Make dialogue, make conversation a salient part of the educational experience. I think that's imperative, especially these days. And I think my field can pivot, to do something like that and kind of lead the way for promoting and instilling civil discourse back into society. I was going to reference some other things here, but I think I'm almost at my time. What time is it?
You're at your time.
Okay.
So, will you
I'll
bring
stop there and say
in
more things
later? Yeah, as the conversation gets going. Thank you very much, Erik. So, just to kind of follow up on that a little bit, I think that's very important because we're not talking about how to fix education. We're talking about learning and how learning is going to have to be rethought and revamped and refacilitated. So, all right, so let's turn now to somebody who's in the business of what we would call learning learning technology. I'm going to call on Darryl Meekins.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Um, my name is Darryl. I'm the co-founder and CAO of Lightbox Consultants. We are a bespoke consultancy that specializes in designing learning adventures and helping people become more competent in their field, working with institutions, colleges, nonprofits, religious institutions, and the like. And I think one of the things that I've learned, having spent a lot of time in education as a professor, as an instructor, but also in administration, um, there is a lot about the structure that we can interrogate. And maybe we'll get into a little bit of that today. But I think part of the interest for me as I think about learning or the crisis, the existential crisis of learning, is that I think humans continue to want to learn. So I hear a lot in more recent times about people being worried that AI is going to do all the thinking for us and that people are going to stop thinking altogether. And that's not unfounded. I think there's definitely some concerns there about people just offloading the difficulty of thinking through problems to something that'll do it for you. But I think at our core, part of the human nature is inquisition. We want to know things, we want to discover things, we want to create things. This is part of who we are as people. So I think really that the crisis is more about the institutions of learning that we have created. It's not a cognitive issue. And I think we agree that the dominant systems that we've created for education across the board, but they were primarily built for an industrial economy, front-loaded, time-bound, seat time, siloed, a very narrow equation of what learning means. And even the credentials that one accumulates at the end of it is meant to mean something that it no longer actually means. So I think that as we move forward, the future looks a lot different than past has. And for us to think about, to use the overused phrase of lifelong learning, that we would probably all espouse and think that's a great thing that people should be doing. I think if we want lifelong human-centered learning for the world in which we live today, we've got to stop living in 1955. The institutions that we have were developed for a different world. And what I would see moving forward is a much more networked environment. I think as I think about institutions of learning, places of learning, wherever they might be, formal, non-formal, informal, they are networked, they are webbed, they're interconnected, and they're not these self-contained silos of knowledge, which knowledge was the product that we would be selling people, and they're no longer buying because the they seek, they're getting for themselves. And so, what is the value worked, an ecosystem, a community that people can go into and be a part of? I also think that when we think about the future of work, I'm at a conference right now, which is a competency-based education network conference, and they talk a lot about workplace readiness, job readiness. And more than ever before, people are concerned, I think, about whether or not somebody is ready to learn once they've exited a place where learning was supposed to have already happened. And I think part of the problem with that is that in more recent times, last couple of years, we've become so concerned about what AI is going to do that we've stopped thinking about what AI is never going to be able to do. And that's those things I mentioned at the beginning about the human-centered aspects of creativity and ingenuity, things that we innately as people can do and should continue to do and want to keep doing. And so for me, I think what has to change is that we move away from thinking that degree functions are the entry. They actually are more often the barrier. And we need to think about competencies, transfer, and real world applicability. And I think that's my time.
Thank you. All right. On that note, then I'm going to move to Dani, who's also, well, I know both of you are adjuncts. You're actually adjuncts at my university, or have been. Darryl has been an adjunct. He's not now, but Dani is right now because you're far afield from what we might call residential learning. You don't sit in the classroom. You design curriculum. You think about all this stuff. You think about learning as opposed to, how can how can that make this work for me? So, Dani, I'll turn it over to you now.
Awesome. Thanks, Carl. So I'm Dani. As Carl mentioned, I teach part-time at DU, which is one of my favorite parts of my work. I'm also the founder and director of a company called the Design Thinker Institute, and we use human-centered practices to help organizations build capability and solve problems. And I do work across the US, New Zealand, and Australia predominantly. And my research area is around, I study organizational and human behavior. And that gives me particularly around how do humans solve problems, and particularly how do they need to be solving problems in the context that most organizations are working in these days and the challenges that they're facing into. And I think the crisis in education now is that we haven't created an environment where people can learn to meet the needs of the 21st century. I think education we've been teaching people almost the same way for the past 100 years, and the world is changing and education is not keeping up. So I think that is fundamentally the crisis, is how do we create the kind of learning that people and organizations need today? And some of the big gaps that I'm seeing as I work across multiple organizations, and the types of gaps that I'm having to help organizations fill, are around the human skills, particularly around like relationship building. And Eric, you mentioned earlier about this whole conversation. That's something that ironically we aren't doing very well at, and I think it's going to get worse the more that AI becomes more prevalent. So how do we teach people to be better listeners, to be more curious? And those types of skills are becoming more and more important. The other one is a lot of my research looked at what are people's views on failure. And the need to fail is becoming more important because the types of problems that organizations need to solve for today don't have like an answer, a finite answer. Often it requires doing a bunch of things, seeing what works, stopping what doesn't, and continuing with what works. But we've trained people to be afraid of failing. And now we're having to train people to be okay with failing and admit that, hey, that didn't work. Like I can fail at something and not be a failure. And that's a big mindset shift that needs to happen. And finally, I think the other thing we have to think about is there needs to be two types of learning, right? So I think there's still a need for that longer term development. Like if we think about how we learned how to read, that didn't happen because we sat in a workshop. It happened over the course of a long period of time. I think things like engaging in dialogue isn't something we're going to learn in a 90-minute workshop. It's something that we need to practice over time in different contexts. So I think we need to have that longer term learning approach, and we need to be able to provide people like micro in the moment learning so that when they're in their work environments and they have to do something, they can learn what they need in that moment.
Yep.
I think that's my time.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, so what we're going to do now is we've got two specialists here, both in higher education and in K through 12 education. As we've talked about in the pre-conference, these distinctions really blur a lot. And of course, it's not that you're a specialist anymore, but you're not just a generalist, you're a global thinker. I think in many ways, that's what we're trying to get. What does it mean to be in a space where we're globally thinking about not just the problems of quote education, but the future of learning and all the possibilities that are being opened up. So we're gonna talk about higher education and then go to K through 12, or we could do it the other way, but I think given kind of where the discussion is going, we'll start with higher education. So I'm going to turn it now to Justin Taylor.
Hi, thanks. I'm Justin Taylor. I'm the director of the Graduate School of Creative Writing at Sewanee, the University of the South. I'm the author of 4 books of fiction and 1 book of nonfiction, and a contributing writer to the Washington Post, among other publications. And so I'm speaking here in my capacity as both a writer and an educator. And I tried to answer this question that was posed to us, what do we mean by the knowledge economy? What kind of learning in our educational institution should play a central role in its development during the coming decades? So I tried to sort of prepare something that would speak directly to that. And because I am a writer, I sort of sketched out my thoughts in writing. So I'm going to try to read that to you now. And so I apologize, it's a little formal, but the good news is because I wrote it and practiced it, I know how long it will take. So I will meet my time. The first thing I want to say is really that to the extent that such a thing exists, what I want from the knowledge economy is the same thing that I want from any local, national, or indeed global economy, which is to say a just and equitable distribution of resources and opportunities, a privileging of the public good above private profit, enforcement mechanisms to protect against abuse, models for long-term sustainability rather than destructive short-term growth, and a focus on what the economy does for the community it serves rather than the other way around. And of course, the current economy that we're in delivers none of those things. So if the knowledge economy largely fails to deliver them either, perhaps it is because we've allowed the pursuit of knowledge, and indeed the work of cultivating humanist values through institutions of learning, to be left to the mercy of the free market. Free markets, as I think we all know, have no mercy. That is not what they're for. Even their most dogged champions will concede their fundamental amorality. The market tolerates profound indifference to human flourishing, and it will, without hesitation, incite violence against citizens, workers, and the very earth. At this moment, for example, the so-called visionary leaders at the forefront of AI technology are draining the aquifers of the West where I live. They're driving energy prices sky high across the country. And here in Tennessee, where my school is based, they are giving half of Memphis lung cancer, burning coal in the name of powering data centers the size of Air Force bases. They are the reason that our children are losing the ability to read and think, that the air we're all breathing is being filled with toxic particulate matter that is going to kill us, and they're the reason that the very fabric of social, spiritual, and civic life is being shredded before our eyes. They have created a giant acceleration engine for mental illness, for non-consensual pornography, for the loneliness epidemic, for political violence, and for mass illiteracy. Wittgenstein tells us that language is the form of thought. This is a complicated idea that occurs deep inside a complicated book, but for the sake of time, if you'll let me be just a little bit reductive, what Wittgenstein means is we think in language, and that therefore the depth and breadth of our facility with language is the limit of our ability to speak, not only to other people, but to ourselves. Just as you cannot think a thought in a language you do not know, you also cannot think a thought in your own language comprised of words you do not know. Facility with language is the metacritical skill. It is in fact the skill that makes all other form of learning possible. And this includes self-knowledge, not least among these. This is the foundation and the backstop of any notion of a knowledge economy, and without it, there is no sense in us talking about critical thinking or intelligence, because these capacities cannot exist and will not exist in the absence of the ability to comprehend, manipulate, and produce language. So to put it really plainly, people are losing the ability to read and to think. A forklift can lift more weight than you can, but bringing a forklift to a gym is not going to make you stronger. To say that the point of exercise is to make sure that certain pieces of metal are getting moved around a room is to fundamentally misunderstand what is happening and why. It doesn't matter if a machine can do it better. It doesn't matter if a machine can do it, period. What matters is that each of us is able to do it at all. And hearing this, a person might reasonably feel that I'm something of an extremist, that I'm exaggerating for rhetorical effect. And all I can say is I would that it were so. Everything I am telling you is already in the public record. I'm a novelist by training, but this is not my imagination at work. It's in the New York Times, it's in the Atlantic, it's in the Wall Street Journal every day. And to be really candid, I'm willing to bet that in your heart of hearts, you already agree with me. You're just not used to hearing these things said out loud in public, where they might have to be dealt with or at least acknowledged. So, the first role of the knowledge economy is to carve out a space where the conservation and cultivation of knowledge, of humanness, is still possible. I'm talking about a Svalbard seed vault or a Jesuit monastery of critical thought. And the universities are in some ways structurally optimized and well equipped to serve such a role, but unfortunately, few of the people who control these institutions share this view of the situation, and fewer still are willing to rise to the call of history, to undertake the difficult, transformative work that the moment actually demands. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Victor Taylor.
All right, good. Well, thank you very much, Carl, for organizing this, and thank you, Gary, for supporting it, and pleasure to meet everyone. So I'd like to begin, I guess, with a little verbal case study. So imagine a group of maybe 300 faculty meeting to discuss revisions to a mission and vision statement at a university. Could be a liberal arts college, land grant, whatever it is. And part of what has to happen is that group has to align itself with the paid consultants who are talking about the market advantage that the brand has in a certain space. And one of the things that's necessary is for the mission statement in particular to talk about the value proposition of the education and what the return on investment is going to be. And so I mention all of that because almost every institution goes through this process at some point, maybe on a regular cycle. And it was this event that led one of my former professors, the late Bill Reddings at Syracuse University, to begin thinking about a book. And it was published in 1996. And sadly, Bill didn't see that publication. But the title of the book is The University in Ruins. And what Reddings says in that book, I think, is very valuable today because it does speak to our current situation. And Eric has touched on it to a certain extent. But Reddings argues that the university has sort of lost touch with culture in the sense that the university has moved to more of a commercial space. It has stopped treating students and faculty and other staff members as members of the community and has started treating them as customers. And while they're treated as customers, it changes the entire orientation of the organization. And so now the question becomes, well, what do we do with this very troubling concept of knowledge in that space? Will customers be ready to read complex texts? Will they understand that they have to develop not just thinking skills, but the capacity to reflect and to communicate with others? Or are they going to demand pre-test rubrics and PowerPoint presentations in order to simplify the knowledge that they just simply need to memorize and repeat on an exam? And so Redding's book, I think, really touches at the core of what the crisis is. And it's already been mentioned. Dani, I think, alluded to it too. It's what's happened, according to Reddings, and this is, of course, 1996, actually prior to that. It's not that the university sort of lost its claim to knowledge, it lost its claim to thought. And what's key to Redding's perspective, and I agree with him as someone who's been in higher education for a long time, as a faculty member and as a senior administrator, it's lost touch with thought in the sense that thought isn't just critical thinking. It's not just a skill set that can be applied to a task, but it's an ability, as I mentioned earlier, to have the capacity for reflection, to be able to contemplate, and to Eric's point, to do that in the context of a community. But important to Reddings, who is informed by the philosophy of Jean-Francois Lyotard, that the goal of it is not to reach consensus or not to establish a grand narrative of thought, but to allow what Reddings refers to via Lyotard as a community of dissensus, the ability to think, but in the context of being willing to debate, the ability to have thought that doesn't necessarily have an ROI, but allows for the development of curiosity, the ability to engage with others in an experimental way, and to put the pressure on the university or the learning institution to allow itself not to close in around absolute or grand narrative-based discourses, to remain open and free for inquiry. And so I'll come back to the idea of the mission statement. No mission statement can capture that, but the goal would be to have a mission statement that sort of preserves both the practical aspects of an education or job training. Very often workforce appears in so many documents of higher ed, workforce development, but also the ability to create a space for thoughtfulness, for contemplation and reflection without the burden of having to come to an absolute agreement with all those around you and still maintain a semblance of a community. So those are my thoughts to get us started tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So higher education, which is always the focus, is impossible without younger people who are learning in their own ways in what we broadly call K through 12 institutions. And of course, that gets a lot of news media. Everybody thinks, well, what do we do about this? So I'm going to call on the other Erik now, who is not in the United States. We tend to be US centric in a lot of our discussions. He has been a school teacher in both countries, but he's also, I understand, in the AI business too. So Erik, what do you?
Okay. Hi, I'm Eric. I'm Carl's son. Um, I'm a writer. I started off writing and I've written 2 novels and now I have a nonfiction book I just got a contract for this week. And then and I'm also creating LLM models based off of personality. And then I also do a lot of academic sort of apps that create that use teaching methods. So a little bit like Justin, I sort of wrote this down a little bit, so I'm going to sound a little bit, but I'm going to try and stay out of it. Um, I guess mine is a little bit. I'm going to try and stick to more through the high school teaching. Um, so one of the things is when I walk into a most high school rooms, you see the rows of chairs, and that rows of chairs or um, the way it's lined up, it all goes back to the industrial age, which I think a few of you have said already. Um, and that it's sort of a factory model of education where we still have that today, where the students are organized into age and grade and levels, and they're seated in a way to sort of maximize efficiency. So you're giving that knowledge to as many students as possible. Now, obviously within laws, you have 30 students within a room, but that starts to fill. But what is that model? Why are we still using that model where you are the teacher standing in front and then the students are absorbing that information? And especially now with AI, like where anybody can type in anything and sort of get that information. Why does the teacher need to be standing in front of the room imparting their wisdom to this group of students? And then one of the things that I think is really interesting is that uh, a group of physicists at 1990s at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York, they they had a cost cutting measures and they had to reduce their room size. So what they did is they used their sort of science, they used their physicist brains to sort of uh, look at lecture halls, look at the lectures, and then they also took in sort of scientific methods about pedagogical shortcomings and how to teach and they realized that when a teacher stands in front of a room, it's the students retain 30%. But when the students learn from each other, it goes up to like 70%. So they started rearranging the room. They took the big workbenches and they put them in circles, and they would have 2 students sitting at the workbench and sort of facing each other in a circle. And from that point on, you had a huge shift in something as simple as uh, how people sit in a classroom. And and um, and this is also where you get the terms from studio spaces and lab. And so when I was first teaching in New York, uh, in Harlem, we had our students sitting in rows because it was the best way to sort of keep them in line, and you could walk through the rows and keep them where they were. But the minute they switched over to group cluster seating, where you had 4 students sitting together, um, it became sort of this thing where teachers were like, why would we do this? Why would you put 4 students in a difficult classroom with kids that have knives and guns and whatever, sitting together, looking at each other, not looking at the teacher? It was insane. But what happened actually is when you get that perfect combination of a student who is good in math, but who is quiet and is not very social, and you get a student that's very social and but not very good in math, but who is a good collaborator. And as a teacher, if you put this together, you can actually create some sort of magic where you have these kids working off of each other, and the teacher takes a step back, is no longer the information giver, but the task giver. So they give they give the idea like, I want you to work on this together. And then the students work together and they create an answer for that. And it changed everything about teaching. And still today in New York, they still use that, and they play with it quite a bit. But in the Netherlands, still where I teach, it's still the teacher still stands on the podium and lectures to the students, and then the students retain the information, and they put it back on a test, and that still goes back to the industrial age. But what has changed about that is that what right now you see a shift in the Netherlands where at 12 years old, kids go into different categories of classes. So at 12, you're tested on their standardized testing, and your teacher looks at where you are. And at 12 years old, they say like, okay, you go into this something that's called VWO, which is university level high school, or you go into HAVO, which is for if you're going to be an administrator for the rest of your life, or you go into FAMBO, which is if you're going to be doing clerical work. So at 12 years old, you're already being sorted and shifted into the direction where you're supposed to go. And that still goes back to the industrial age. Like, look at the student. We have a volume of student coming in, and where do they fit and how do they fit into society? And let's push them there. And only within the last 5 years, I think, you're starting to see like, okay, there's a problem here, because right now at 12 years old, the kids with immigrant backgrounds are pushed lower, while the kids who are white are pushed higher. And you're starting to see a little bit of change, but still it's very slow. The Netherlands is still very behind on those kind of things. So
Thank you.
what was that? It? Okay. It's my time up.
Five
Okay.
minutes. Yeah, we get back into this. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll conclude with Paul Wolfe, who's in private education, and I know you go for it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this discussion. I am a head of school emeritus at the Cambridge School of Dallas. Dr. Ramos, Joshua Ramos, who's with us tonight, is one of my colleagues here. He actually was one of my college students also when he was a freshman in college, and I was a professor there at that time. Yes, even though I'm now in secondary education, middle and secondary school, we don't have a grammar school. I have still spent 20 years of my career, that was my second career, 20 years as a professor in higher education. I have found that I've become more enriched and provoked to learning in secondary education than I was in higher education, which I don't know if that's a commentary on me or a commentary on higher education, but it was indeed the case. The other thing I found is my first career, as I speak sort of in 20-year increments, almost rounding up a little bit on two of them. My first career was as a carpenter and a home builder. And so most of my learning was in fact on the job. So keep that in mind as I go to my prepared comments here, because if I said what enriched me almost equally to secondary education, I would say my work as a carpenter and a home builder. And so when I talk about my 10 theses as practical and foundational elements to real education, I'm not speaking strictly of an educational institution. In fact, I kind of agree, not kind of, I agree wholeheartedly with our founding headmaster, who said, look, give me a hillside or a pup tent and we can educate people, right? Doesn't matter where it is, doesn't matter what the formal curriculum might be and that sort of thing. It is me with the students. I was struck by Justin's comments about the priority of language, because in doing a little preparation for tonight, I came across a statement by Barack Obama, who said the currency of the knowledge education is literacy. So we're in a deeper crisis than we might realize. It's not just that educational institutions are in fact ill-suited for a knowledge economy, especially if you want to think of true education. It is, again, as Justin said, our whole culture, because we're losing literacy. One of the things that concerns me as I define, not just me, but as we think about the definition of knowledge economy, it is the production and dissemination of knowledge and information quickly monetized, likely technical knowledge and information at first, moving toward more common knowledge and information utilized in new ways through the development of new skills and new tools. So in other words, this is a very dynamic situation and is changing rapidly, not just from the time we were born to today, but from today to 2 years from now, right? And we all recognize that. I'm also reminded, many of you, I'm sure, know of Matthew Crawford, the philosopher, social critic, who for many, many years was a good thinking motorcycle mechanic. And he finally got his PhD and learned he could make a good living speaking. And so he's doing that. Who said, we get stupider and stupider with every generation due to automation, which leads to learned dependence or learned ignorance. I think he's right. Now, I do not use the terms learning and education interchangeably. So in what follows, I'm thinking more of true learning. True education. Learning is a means to true education, but you can learn a lot of things and not be truly educated, right? And so what my following comments sound like is more immediately attached to educational institutions. Yes, absolutely. But educational institutions that are different from the norm today, and it doesn't have to be educational institutions. So I want to simply state 10 missing elements from learning today that lead to true education, characteristics and commitments. And then I'll give commentary later, possibly, but I just want to state these 10 things very quickly. And our school tries to live these out in the way we do all that we do. Number one, true education cannot be separated from foundational understanding, not mere knowledge or learning, but understanding the true foundations. Number two, understanding cannot be separated from contextual assessment, central to what many refer to as critical thinking. Number three, contextual assessment cannot be separated from the full scope of the liberal arts, both ancient and recent. Number four, true education demands conscious purpose and ends. This is a real problem with the Industrial Revolution, where you just put people in an assembly line, and often they didn't understand certain things about the ends. So this is what the ancients called a telos, namely in education, in true education, the formation of people so that they themselves are committed to lives of virtue, thus contributing to a virtuous society and playing a contributive part in the social contract which we are supposed to have with one another, and yet it has been lost in today's culture. Number five, true education must recognize and reckon with permanent things, the so-called transcendentals. I read a cultural philosopher who designs and makes furniture, and I was struck by this fella. Now, this is not a religious fella at all, but he said, look, I can take a piece of a piece of birch wood that I'm working on. I really needed white oak, and I can spend all day long trying to bullshit that piece of white oak maple into becoming a piece of white oak. But I'm never going to be successful. It is what it is. And the fact is, that's true with the foundational things in the world, and it applies to much of what we engage in day by day. All right, 5 more. True education must recognize it.
Quickly.
Okay. Reckon with permanent things, so-called transcendentals. True education is a personal and thus relational effort. Teachers teach students. Thus, true education cannot be separated from the character of both the teacher and the learner. True education demands coherent integration of subjects and persons. True education is best pursued in community or relationship with other learners. True education involves the epistemological partnership of reason and faith. I don't just mean religious faith. True education reckons with what is, and thus the search for truth or permanent reality, which is a permanent reality.
All right.
I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And of course, everybody's got a lot to say here. We have a lot to do, and I want everybody to really kind of listen to what everybody said. We heard about the notion of deep listening, and so let me ask a question to get us started. And by the way, if could you use the Zoom function to raise your hand? And I can see the screen. We don't have too many people here right now, and so I can call on you. But we've talked about learning, education, the knowledge economy, but what it really comes down to ultimately is the students, the people. And, whether we're talking about some gifted and talented, genius, who's gone to a private Ivy League university, or we're talking about like what Erik was talking about, the kids in Harlem. You're dealing with everybody in their unique situation there. And the question is, okay, how do we engage these people with the vast changes, the new technologies, and everything that is happening around us? So it gets down to the question, and one of the prompts that was given to you to reflect upon before this symposium is, okay, what do we mean by the knowledge economy? And I'd like to kind of reformat the question a little bit to say, what do we mean by the knowledge economy in the sense of the people who are participants in the knowledge economy? How do we make those changes in attitudes, values? That's not just young people, it's also parents, it's also old people, because education is not just for young people. So I'm gonna open it up in that particular way. And so let's just start from the human factor, if we can. Anybody wanna?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that it's not just for young people, and that's something that I think about a lot. So the program that I run, we get some traditional graduate students, people in their early, mid, maybe late 20s, but a lot of the people that we work with are in their 30s and 40s. We get a fair number of people in their 50s, even into their 60s, who have had a lifelong interest in creative writing, but have never had the opportunity to really pursue it. They've had careers in other things. Maybe they're coming to us because they're at a place where they can take some time off, or their kids are out of the house, or whatever. And so I think this idea of lifelong learning that a lot of us have articulated in some form or other is a really important one. And I think it's worth emphasizing, particularly if we are talking about higher education, that while the core of it will probably always be the kind of 18 to 29 demo, we expect people to go to college after high school, or we hope that they will. And we expect most people who go to graduate school to go, if not immediately after undergrad, within a reasonable time frame if they want a career in the advanced discipline. These are massive institutions that are in fact very well suited to serve people at all stages of life and touch a lot of different aspects of the culture. And that if the institution is willing to open itself up in that way, whatever community it's in, whatever region it's in, those people exist. And that part of the function of being an institution of higher learning, I think, is embracing this idea of lifelong learning, not as an afterthought, but as part of what it means to participate in civic life, as part of what it means to be a cultivated person, as part of what it means to be a full person.
Anybody want to take that further, that idea further?
Well, I think what we're doing, what we need to do anyway, and I'm responding to, the polarization in American society right now, and the fact that people would rather, pull a trigger than talk these days. I'm trying to formulate citizens that collaborate, citizens that realize that rhetoric is epistemic. I think somebody brought up Wittgenstein a little bit earlier. There's a rhetorician named R.L. Scott who talks about rhetoric as epistemic, meaning, we don't just find knowledge and figure out a rhetorical way to convey it. The language is how we find the knowledge, right? It's how we find the meaning in that knowledge anyway, right? Gravity is separate from language, but what that means to us, is something that we have to articulate through words and through negotiating meaning with one another, right? I want to create citizens that have what's called defensive confidence. What do I mean by this? People aren't afraid of arguments. They're afraid of losing arguments, right? If we give them the proper skills, to give them the confidence to enter into an argument, and knowing that, they could hold their own here, I think more people will be able to do it. More people will be willing to do it. What's more, and as somebody else said this before, I think Dani said this, failing does not mean you're a failure, right? Losing the argument doesn't mean you're a loser, right? It means you collaborated towards a certain new knowledge, and your original thought just wasn't quite there. That kind of attitude is what I want to instill in students who will go out into the world and be fulfilled citizens, right? So that's my idea of it.
Anybody else?
I just want to respond to that last bit that Eric said, because I think fundamentally education or schooling has been around, you go to school, you listen, you take an exam, and the foundation has been, you're either right or you're wrong. And the world doesn't work that way. And so then we expect these people, these young people, to go out into the world, engage in these conversations, engage in argument. And then when they don't win, they're crushed. And then the more that they don't win, the less and less, or the more and more disengaged they become, because we haven't taught them how to fail well or to fail upwards.
Yeah, I think I could follow up on that. Back what Eric said about being in a community. I'll just kind of go back to Redding's but Lyotard's notion of a community of dissensus, that one of the things when you're in a highly political higher ed environment, one of the things students report is they don't want to engage with each other because they're afraid of violating something for which people reach consensus. That they don't know what it is. They just know there's something out there everyone agrees on, and they don't want to violate that. And so it produces these deep silences on campus, and that when they do disagree, they find it hard to formulate disagreement because they feel that somehow their identity is tied up with their agreement or disagreement. So it becomes very personal to them, and they haven't learned sort of the academic art of debate and dialogue. They sort of they take it on as a existential challenge to themselves. And I'll just make one quick point. Years ago, I had a student, very in world religions, very critical of other religions. And I said to him, I just said, well, don't you, that other people believe in their religion just as much as you believe in yours, right? And it was like a moment of shock on his face that how could that ever be? But I think not realizing that pushes students into these spaces where they don't want to engage with each other and they don't want to have dialogue.
What about at the
That's-
K2 level? I mean, because that's where it starts. This is where the masses of people are. And what you talk about, the educational system is being designed originally to serve the industrial economy, but we don't have an industrial economy anymore. And now we have something called video games, and we have all sorts of distractions. We have TikTok and so forth. And how do you get younger people, very young people, motivated? And how does this kind of feed up, into not just higher education, but the corporate world and so forth? How do you get society as a whole motivated to take learning seriously?
I can just maybe just jump in here really quickly. So I guess I come from things from a very practical kind of perspective, and at the heart, I'm very much a pragmatist. um, I think, if I go back to when I was still in the university system, when Google came more ubiquitous, and I remember, faculty members, kind of the sky is falling. Have you seen this thing called Google? Now people can just search for whatever they want and it's going to show up on a web page. We're done, we're toast. And so on it has become sort of every few years when there's a technological breakthrough, people think, well, this is it. We're done. Students are not going to think for themselves anymore. People are not going to do things for themselves anymore. They have access to all this web content and everything else. And yet it hasn't happened. So nothing's quite as bad as we think it's going to get, and it's not as good as as we hope it's going to be. And I think the same thing is true with where we're at right now. And in a sense, we've gotten what we created. So when we talk about, well, why, if we say, for example, that we don't think students or learners are wanting to learn, or they've become lazy, or they become distracted. Well, what part of the apparatus have we created that's given them that sort of impression? I think our current knowledge production models that we have in universities are exactly designed for that. Universities, they create positions for faculty members who their job security is tethered to them publishing in journals that practitioners cannot access and they never use. Um, Firms commission insights, but then they hoard them as trade secrets. Governments commission reports that they then keep to themselves as well. So, as much as we like to talk about the democratization of knowledge, and even often what's connected to that is issues of justice and people who will write and think and talk and whose voices are very important in that conversation, they're also sort of trading in the capitalistic tendencies that come with that. They're selling books to people who can't afford to buy them. The very people that they're intending to say, these are the ones we're trying to serve the most, the people who don't have a voice that you want to give a voice to and everything else. So I think of our systems of creation and knowledge production that we have created. Now with the rise of something like GPT, people are starting to say, well, to hell with you guys. We don't need any of you anymore. We can just do it ourselves. And of course, that's not true, because meaning making is essential to the learning of any person. Someone needs to help them create meaning out of the knowledge. It's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. That's never really served anyone very well. But we have ourselves, I think, shot ourselves in the foot by sort of having a pedestal of knowledge and the way in which people acquire that knowledge that I think the collective masses are rebelling against.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, ChatGPT, because that leads into the question we really haven't talked about, we need to talk about, because everybody's talking about it right now, and that's AI. And there was a comment made, that we don't need somebody to tell us anymore, what to know. As a teacher, I've discovered that. I was thinking, why am I doing this? Why am I just lecturing? Because we have this credit hour system. So why don't we just let them all work with AI? That's what I do, and let them ask questions. Just kind of shepherd the process. Let them work in teams. So what about AI in this whole role? I mean, let's looking at it in terms of how it's really going to in some ways address the existential crisis?
Well, the first thing to understand is that the promise of AI is a lie. It's not true. It cannot, specifically with regard to the large language models and this idea of AI as a replacement for education. You want to talk about using computational technology for STEM stuff. You want to talk about using it to run equations. You want to talk about checking medical results. Those are all really interesting things that should be pursued that AI can do. But the idea that AI is going to tell you something original, that it has any capacity for inductive reasoning, is a lie. It is a lie. And it is not true now, and it will never be true. And I say that not only as someone who's invested personally in my career as a writer, whatever, but literally as someone who's part of the settlement for the Anthropic lawsuit, for the mass plagiarism that the large language models committed by stealing the work of all writers. Like they just scanned millions of books. And I'm a party to that settlement. My name appears in the list of what the court forced them to disclose. They stole my books and they made like a weird little fake person out of it. And so I'm going to get a couple $1,000 at some point, whatever. But AI is useless at inductive reasoning. And it will only get worse because mostly what it does, other than what it can steal that's uploaded to it, is it scrapes us off the internet. And so it's scraping Reddit, it's scraping things that are not based in any kind of knowledge or information. And so all it can do is recycle garbage. And this is why earlier I called it an acceleration engine for all these vile things. And I don't mean it hyperbolically at all. I'm literally describing the thing that's happening. If you took the worst of your comment section, if you took the worst of a John Birch Society newsletter from the 1950s, just the most delusional bullshit imaginable, and then put it in a machine that multiplied it by 1,000 and sprayed it all over the world like a crop duster, that's what we're talking about, right? So there is no future for that. And the only people that are arguing that that's ever going to have a leading role in humanities education, in artistic education, in teaching rhetoric, they're just people whose profit motive is entirely tied up in lying to you and stealing from you. So that I think is the first thing to understand. And I know that sounds very extreme, but it's really quite real, and it's materially real in the sense of like court cases, intellectual property, like not in an abstract way. Like that's what it is.
Anybody want to respond to that? I know, Victor, you're setting up an AI center, right?
Yeah, so yeah, we're setting up, going to co-direct a Center for AI Innovation and Emerging Technologies. May come as a surprise, but I don't disagree with Justin on this. I mean, I think what he's described does describe a part of AI. I mean, it's how it functions. It indiscriminately just crawls through the web and gathers things. It takes tokens and statistically matches them together. It doesn't think. It doesn't do inductive reasoning. I do think there's a point at which it could reach absolute zero, where it's just recycling itself. My perspective on it is, well, all that is true, I think, or you can reasonably argue that. That still puts some pressure on us, because I always argue that I'm not advocating for AI, I'm advocating for AI literacy with students. And the goal is that students will become AI literate across their disciplines, not just in computer science, but I say also in theater. But that literacy isn't just using AI in order to go to the workplace and be a more efficient, whatever manager, whatever they're going to be, but to sort of look into the things that Justin described, to be critical thinkers, to be skeptical, to see the limits of it. And I'll just give a quick example. I had a faculty member saying I'm not going to do AI literacy because I'm not allowing AI in my class. And I said, why? And then they explained. I thought it was a good explanation. And I said, but you know what? If you tell your students that and you explain it, you're doing AI literacy. You're helping them put it into context and understand. And so, and I think all those things that Justin talked about we're in South Dakota. They're looking for a big data center. I don't know where they're going to put it. There's no water here. There's no coast to do that. But I do think that it's a reality we have to deal with. And it's really a question of it, since it's not going away, we have to find the most effective way to deal with it, consistent with our values, and also maintain what Ethan Malik talks about, treat it as a co-intelligence, but make sure there's always a human in the process of AI in some form, some human intervention, some human actor, and it just doesn't run on its own.
Right. And of course, let's say some of the kind of statements that are being out there in thoughtful expositions of what AI is saying. And look, AI is not going to do it for you. It's not going to take everybody's job away. It's going to take some jobs away, but it can also be used in some way. And that's why we talk about critical intelligence. That critical intelligence is, which goes with literature, is about how to use AI and how to use it effectively and how to use it productively and how to use it in a way which everybody benefits. I mean, yes, there is a lot of BS out there about AI. But the question is, it's not going to go away. I remember when the internet first, and I was an early adapter, all excited about the internet back in the 90s. And I remember in a higher education saying, well, the internet doesn't really have anything to do with higher education. Well, because it was at a kind of primordial stage then. But no, look where we are right now. Okay, so it's not going to go away. And the question is not just we have to combat it as a threat. What can we do with it? And does anybody have anything to say about how we can do that?
I do, Carl. Let me interject here.
You want to take over as moderator now, by the way?
Sure, yeah. So I hear a lot of game theory going on here. I know that we've had conversations, Victor, about AI being a co-intelligence, but there's some fascinating, and I've been an athlete my whole life, so a lot of my wild learning has happened. I think in some ways, Dani, it's like long term. You're playing a game, you know all the rules, you know the whole intention, but the real interesting learning is when the ball gets hyped and all hell breaks loose and you're in that micro learning situation that you talk about. The same thing with Erec, Raschke. Erik, when you were talking about problem solving and the way that students can be configured to interact, and that really it's a group kind of behavior that generates. All of this strikes me as an opportunity to understand learning from the context of game theory. And I would interject, Justin, and one of the things that I've observed in my own research with technology is that it is like like human behavior itself. If we look at someone like Lonergan's idea of humans being defined as the unrestrained desire to know, right, which I think is behind the knowledge economy. My sense is that we've always been knowledge creatures. That's why we're called Homo sapien. Every phase of evolution has been triggered by some kind of advancement in knowledge. But the counterpose to Lonergan, Bernard Lonergan, is Friedrich Nietzsche, who I think complements that with what I call the unrestrained desire for power. And both of those dynamics are always happening. And so we have AI is now it is infiltrated into our culture, and it has really taken over it's expressing itself in an unrestrained manner. And the question is, how do we restrain it? Which also gets back to kind of like game theory, and this idea that we've talked about, Victor, which is the way you think of AI as kind of a co-intelligence to human intelligence. And I define human intelligence as I, which is information, imagination, innovation, and invention. So it would be interesting to put to have comments in that regard in terms of how everyone might put this into a game kind of theory, because game theory is something that happens spontaneously, extemporaneously, but it can lead to long-term learning, and Dani's sense of that. So does that resonate with anyone? I guess not.
No, I think,
I
I mean,
oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I think what you're talking about is what I call, when we think about how we're going to use AI, it's these two ideas of intentionality and ethics. And I think at the moment, because, AI is the new kid on the block and getting the new shiny object that everybody's enamored with, there isn't a lot of conversation about how do we intentionally use this and what are our ethical boundaries around how we will
Right.
use it, how we will train it. And that's what's not happening. But I also feel like that's also where we need people like us that are thinking about the broader context of this engaging in AI, because I think the risk is if we as educators say, actually, I'm just, going to wash my hands of this and walk away, then we're actually not helping shape the future of that. And then I think that's where this is just going to get ugly and scary and dangerous. So in conversations with organizations and clients I work with, like those are two things that we talk about. Okay, you want to bring AI in, but why? What is it? What's the intentionality behind it? What is it going to get you? And then you kind of start seeing that they come to the conclusion, actually, it can help us do some of these repetitive, tasks that are repetitive, that are kind of that basically aggregating information we already have. It's not very good at inductive, abductive kind of thinking, which is what organizations really need. So I think that. And then also the ethics part of it, I feel like that's not even a conversation that is being had.
But that in a way, Donnie, that's also talking about the rules of the game, right? So you're setting up a kind of game in a corporate organization, and AI becomes a tool. It is restrained in that sense because you've already set up some rules about how it's significant, how it can be used.
Yeah.
Look,
So just
I,
as a real concrete example, so like one of the things that one of my clients is doing is like one of their rules is talking with clients, engaging with clients will always be a human task. Finding leads can be an AI task, but they have to be qualified by a human. So that's how, so these are kind of just examples of
right.
how we think about the roles. Sorry, Eric.
Oh no, no problem at all. Just to put some hope out there, again, my field is largely pedagogical, especially when it comes to writing. So they're in survival mode right now, and that survival mode has prompted a lot of white papers on critical AI literacy. These conversations are being had. That's from an official Modern Language Association in collaboration with the College Composition and Communication Conference, right? To talk about, the ethics behind AI, literacy behind AI, what it does well, what it does not do well, right? These conversations are being had. Now, some of it is people trying to justify their jobs, right? And I don't blame them from that. They're in a tough situation. I was able to pivot, out of it, but a lot of people are not. But these conversations are being had, and at worst, they're promoting teaching to an app or something like that. But at best, they are talking about critical AI literacy, right? And that is kind of devolving into critical AI theory, which is exactly what it sounds like. But we can get into that a little bit later on. But these conversations are being had.
I
Yeah.
think
Thank
I'll
you,
probably
Eric. Yeah.
just make one quick point to what Dani said. So we're creating a Center for AI Innovation. As I said, the important thing to keep in mind is that a humanities person is running it. It's not someone from the engineering college, and everything that Dani said is part of that AI ethical matrix that is part of the literacy. And so I think if there's any hope, I mean, to speak to what Justin talked about of getting some control over it, it's that the humanities folks, even though it's, a lot of engineering, computer science, we have to play a role in how this is shaped and how the game, Gary, is set up from the beginning. We have to be involved.
Paul, you
Yeah,
had
I want to add one little short thing about he was saying, Gary was saying about the putting kids in groups. And one of the things that I would spend hours as a teacher is I'd watch these 30 kids and how they were interacting and how they were working together. And then I would make minor changes. I'd move one kid here and one kid here and one kid here and sort of like, okay. But one of the things that AI is actually really good at, and one of the apps that I'm working on is sort of like you take, as bad as they are, standardized scores, you take the students, their personality, you do it and you feed it all in. And the AI is really good at taking that sort of disparate information and then sort of coming up with sort of a seating chart that says like, okay, this is actually, maybe you should put this kid who is really good at science next to a kid who's really good at reading because they also are struggling with this. And then there's another student that can help them with that. So you're sort of, it's really good at bringing that together. So I do see that is co-thinking. So I wanted to add that part.
You sound like a football coach or a sports coach, which is trying to put a player into the best position that they can be to facilitate, the team, so again, it gets back to some game theory, but also teamwork. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me jump in and make a couple of quick comments. I can't buy into the idea of AI as co-intelligence. I personally think it's more appropriate to think of it as a co-informant. I remember as a child, I would sit down and just read for an hour or two the encyclopedia. I sort of equate AI to a dynamic, on the move encyclopedia that's being revised every nanosecond. But it doesn't do the thinking for us. Intelligence implies, full capacity for understanding, perception, things like that. I personally think that's a better way to think about it. In terms of use, I remember two things. When I first started teaching high school, but even in college as well, I was overwhelmed with the students' use of Wikipedia for an authoritative source, right? And we all know it can be helpful, but it should not be regarded as authoritative. And we tried to be careful to take the time to explain that, which leads me to your earlier question, Carl, about how do we engage people in a knowledge economy regarding the economy and real learning, help them learn, that sort of thing. We have to motivate them. We have to inspire them in some way or another. And I can't help but I can't pass up the opportunity to say, I think the Socratic approach still has a very, very strong place in all of this. Namely, you start with people where they are. You ask good questions, both of AI and people, which again gets back to the cultural or the AI literacy, I should say. And then you try and use what feedback you get to take them where you hope they will eventually go. And that's a long-term process usually, unless it's a very, very simple and simplistic argument or goal in mind. So those are a few of my thoughts.
No, I think that's very well taken, Paul. Particularly the idea, because it's consonant with my idea of the I, where and co-intelligence is maybe just a little sexier. And by the way, it was Victor's idea, so it's his fault. But the idea of it being an informant, it comes in at the beginning of the chain of information, and then imagination, innovation, and invention, if we want to think of it like that. But it clearly, it's the human mind that's at play. And I emphasize play because, again, I think it gets back to a sense of game theory. Did somebody else have a comment?
Darryl.
But let Dani go because she actually obeyed you and put her hand up. So
Such a rule
Yes.
follower. The one thing that I do want to mention before we move off the topic of AI is one thing that I am worried about is the impact of use of AI on developing brains. So much of education, I know that we teach adults as well, but particularly when it comes to developing brains, we know that a prefrontal cortex, where our executive function happens, now we know that takes about 20 plus years to develop. And I think a big part of that development are, foundational things that we've been doing for centuries, like how we teach people how to read, how we teach people how to engage in conversation. Like conversation and talking is such a big part of how, young minds learn. So that is something. And then the other factor of that is we don't know the impact that the use of AI will have on developing brains, the same way that we did not know the impact of social media on developing brains, and we know that now. So I think there is an opportunity for us to make some assumptions that, hey, this could end up like social media on young minds. So what do we do to make sure that we don't end up in the same place? And I think that's a critical part that as educators we need to be thinking about.
I just want to throw one
Well,
really quick thing onto that, because a lot of what we're talking about in this conversation with AI really just centers around LLMs or GPT or things like that. But a really positive use case, is the idea of translation. I just came back a few months ago from working with some communities in India, and there's vast communities that only speak a a lesser known language within the Indian context. And before, access to being able to have conversations with people that didn't speak their language would be very small. But now, there is opportunity for real time, on the go translation. The new AirPods that came out have that capability. I haven't tested it yet, but it seems to be very positive. Through things like Google Lens and everything else, people can actually just take images of something someone's written down and be able to see it in your own language. And of course, real-time translation of things with Google Docs and whatever else. Those are just really helpful tools that especially for people who have been deprived of education for so many years because it's not in their language, now have access to a lot more things than they did before. So as much as I think the cautions and things that we've spoken about tonight are really important to consider, there's also vast accomplishments that AI has helped to accelerate that I think are going to make a contribution.
Yeah. Can I just come back to, I really recommend Ethan Mollick's book, Co-Intelligence. I'll let him make his argument, but I think it's how you use AI. So for instance, we have an AI tutor that's available to all students, and it isn't like Google doesn't give an answer. It walks the student through the problem. It really does function as a tutor, a thought partner. It's built on ChatGPT. So the students experience, anyone using it, the experience is that you are in a conversation and you're being helped to help. It's helping you to think. It's not thinking for you. And I think those we do have that side of AI that's helpful. And then to Darryl's point, AI technology being able to make information accessible to people with disabilities is just really remarkable. And and not just documents, but other ways in which you know spreadsheets and PowerPoints and everything are now readable to students with visual impairments and things. It's just really it's changing the game for them, to go back to Gary's analogy.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting segue for perhaps the next phase of our conversation, which I think Dani mentioned it, and that is literacy and language. Certainly, Justin put great emphasis on language, and I think we all have, and particularly literacy. But my concern, and this particularly could be addressed to Paul and Erik, Raschke, and anyone that's dealing with incoming K-12 students, and that's the crisis of learning, the existential crisis of learning. I think we have to consider how it begins with literacy, or the diminishment of literacy, particularly as Paul mentioned it, in terms of, automation just makes us stupider. And so why don't we comment, why don't we think about where we go from here, given that we have, for reasons that I think people have made good observations about the industrial model of education. Yeah, that's probably what's happening. But where do we go from here to get kids to be literate so that they can enter into these more, sophisticated learning and educational games and play? Because if they can't read and write, they're not able to play. And I can't emphasize enough how concerning that is, and how we can't. It seems like the whole thing about education and learning in the 21st century in America is now about literacy. So, what are our thoughts about that?
Can I
Well-
help rephrase the question a little bit?
Please.
You mentioned language, and somebody brought up Wittgenstein here, who did not see the language as something in itself, but language is a form of life. And I look at learning not so much as an institutional kind of setup that you work within, because the institutions are evolving. One of the problems is that the institutions they're totally outdated. I mean, we can't get rid of them, but at the same time, we can't be stuck with them either. So the issue becomes, okay, how do we forge new forms of life, and how do we structure these? And of course, ultimately, we have to ask the question, how are they financed and so forth? But what would these forms of life for this new kind of learning look like, especially for young people? And I don't teach, K through 12 and never have, but I mean, that's where it all starts. And that's where the tech revolution starts. I mean, Gen Z is iGen. They don't know anything else other than computers and iPads and that sort of thing. So what would these new forms of life that bring forward, not just literacy as part of it, but and literacy is a specific kind of pedagogy. What would these forms of life look like?
Well, I have my hand up, and so I'll respond to both of you. One of the things I fear, and I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but one of the things I fear is that with AI, students are immediately provided, if they don't have it modeled in a better way, and of course, even in a secondary and middle school context like I'm in, they've got 10 or 12 years of profound influence before they ever get to me. Higher ed's double that, right? So I fear that AI gives the young people an excuse for not learning how to read. And therefore, it's going to make the literacy problem doubly bad. But the fact is, we've seen that many cultures throughout history and still today in the world actually are predominantly oral cultures. I wonder if we in the West aren't actually moving to that. I don't know. It's not going to be immediate by any means, but I do think we, in spite of cultures surviving like that, they are surviving in the midst of a great poverty of understanding because they don't read. And I don't think that's a mirage. I think that's true. Yeah.
I think
Eric Raschke, if you're, go ahead, Eric Smith. Yeah.
I was going to say I recently wrote an essay arguing that my field should now pivot to orality, right? How do we speak extemporaneously, not just monologues, but dialogues, things like that? That should be the new focus because, well, I was a little less optimistic when I wrote it. AI has, totally ruined, writing pedagogy, so maybe we should spin to something else. And I was all about, hey, let's re-embrace civil discourse, orality, speaking to each other extemporaneously in real time. Let's let's emphasize those skills. So I'm with you.
Yeah. Erik, Raschke, I'd be really interested to hear what you might say about working with high school age.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of sacrilegious for me to say as a writer who's spent my entire life writing and focusing on words and language to say like I'm in the camp. I do feel like we are shifting away from that literacy is, to me, I'm not quite sure what literacy is. Like, for example, I have for a long time I was teaching high school here with kids that are Moroccan kids that were about to go to jail basically. And they would use ChatGPT to modify their electric bikes to go as fast as their scooters could go, right? So they took something that these kids could not read very well, and they were failing their tests, but they could use AI to do something that very few people could do. And now they can go really, really fast on their bikes, faster than, scooters, faster than cars. And that taking their knowledge and applying it and using AI is a sort of literacy, but they can't read per se. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's interesting, Erik. So that's an example of what I call wild learning, but that does not, in a way, then contribute to culture, which I think is Paul's argument. And the question is, how can we end up with education and not just learning? And the whole kind of intentionality here is for literacy and learning and education to cultivate culture, So, fast bikes don't make culture,
Well, in the Netherlands, bikes do make culture. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Gary, I mean, in some ways to try to speak to what you're saying, I think in a way, like we have to move away. I think even in this conversation, although it's been very productive and really interesting and valuable, I think we're all sort of like acting from a kind of fantasy of like what things could be or what a perfect use case would be or like what the ideal outcome is or like what things might be in the future. But if you're really talking about AI technology, you're talking about the largest sector of the stock market, a company like Nvidia whose market cap is now higher than the entire healthcare industry. And so in a way, we should sort of anti-theorize this. We should talk about like what is actually happening right now? Like what are the things that are actually being done? What are the use cases that are being applied in the present moment? And so, look, I live on the West Coast. I teach in Tennessee, but I just spent 6 weeks in New York City. I was guest teaching at the graduate school at Columbia. And so I was riding the subway every day. And so I can tell you, and this is, first person anecdotal, whatever you want to call it, but all the ads in the subway right now are being bought out by an AI company called friend.com. And what they're selling, what every ad inside the station and inside the car, what every single panel of advertising says is replace your friends. And the slogans they're using are like, it's all in the first person. I will never leave dirty dishes in the sink. I will binge watch with you anything you want. And so, what the market is doing with the technology right now is encouraging people to cut themselves off from actual friendship, from family, from sexual partners, from anything, and to spend time alone with a robot that lives in their phone to do profoundly antisocial things. That's I mean, and again, this is not anecdotal, it's not hyperbolic. This is what is being sold. If you click through the link that's advertised on the poster, this is where it goes. And you can pay a company to give you a robot that will sit with you while you watch television by yourself. Like that is the primary use case for the technology right now, as expressed by the commercial market for the technology. This is what the market is telling you it wants, what it thinks it can sell, and what it thinks it can do. And so when I look at that, in a certain sense, my question is no longer about the future, it's really about the present. And the question is like, how much of this profoundly destructive, antisocial, anti-human behavior are we willing to tolerate? And, we have not talked about this a lot, but like just to say as we kind of close out this 2 hours and looking at the clock, a lot of us have some orientation toward theology. Carl, that's where you spent your career. Paul, I think you've also spent a fair amount of time working in religious institutions and thinking about these things. And that is not where I've been spent my career, but it's something that's interesting to me. It's something I think about a lot. And so just to say it as plainly as I possibly can, when you are talking about refusing the human in favor of interaction with beings that are not ensouled, right? Like do not have a soul, like ensoulment in the classical theological sense. When you are talking about the fabrication of consciousness without subjectivity or ethics, you're essentially talking about the summoning of demons. You're talking about necromancy. And I'm sorry, but there's no other way to describe this in practical terms other than to speak about it in those ways. And so when I am on the subway train and I see all these ads that are like, abandon your friends, refuse your family, sit alone with the thing. Like you're talking about you're talking about Miltonic Satan. You're talking about self-made hell. You're talking about the prison of being. You're talking about Augustinian notions of apartness from God. Like these people are trying to send us to hell. And every orientation that we have toward what they're doing and how we deal with them should be based on that understanding.
Well, and I think your comments, Justin, really for me segue to the whole one of the other key questions that we were asking tonight, which is critical thinking. So what are the tools of critical thinking that the individual in the subway has or needs or can use to discern the difference between a robotic friend and the kind of intersocial play and action that Dani was talking about, for example, as a form of learning. I mean, I think you're absolutely right.
Right.
But that goes back to the age-old problem of anonymity and what is soul. And you're absolutely right. I mean, these are ultimately they're questions of ultimate concern if we want to talk about Paul Tillich's notion of a secular ultimate concern. But critical thinking, again, I'm going to say, it has to start with literacy and intercommunication, social communication, and community. And it sounds to me like I think you're making the point very well, Justin, that when a person is lost into the AI universe, which is in fact an artificial, contrived universe, but it still can be projected to be real, even though of course it's not. What rescues culture from that would have to be our sense of critical thinking, which ultimately is what we I think we hope to arrive at with this with education and with learning. Okay. Again, I get back to the worry though that if we don't have literacy, then we can't really even begin to communicate with one another. Okay. But I think AI is symptomatic of that, but it's the latest and most powerful version of that. But I'm concerned that underneath all of what you just said is really the question of whether culture is living and proceeding with critical thinking. Okay. And what do we mean by critical thinking? It's the discernment of reality. It's the ability to, as I think was it Dani was saying, someone was saying that it's the ability to live with without a full consensus. It's the ability to live with disagreement and with Lyotard's notion of a larger community of what did you call it, Victor? Desensus, right?
Yeah,
Maybe you have
community of
something to say.
consensus. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, to Justin's point, I think all that is true. Scott Galloway just wrote a book, What It Means to Be a Man, or something of that title, where young men are trapped in AI and virtual relationships. My feeling on this is that this is all the more reason to really the challenge of the humanities in particular,
Yes.
or anything else, to really be stepping forward to offer alternatives. I'll give you a quick example. There's a annex dining hall near my building. So I go over there, and I'm not exaggerating, with a few exceptions, all the students are sitting by themselves eating lunch, staring into their phones.
Right.
They're not interacting with each other. And I'll go over, I'll sit down next to somebody, I'll start talking to them, And what's interesting is they don't just keep looking at their phone, they actually put it down and they start engaging. So I still think there's some there's some hope that if there's an alternative to there's some alternative human engagement that people will gravitate toward it. But to Justin's point, it is overwhelming and it is powerful. And it is inviting, especially, in a culture where even in higher ed, young men, especially rural young men, feel disinvited to participate in all the things that we discussed tonight. And then what are they left with? These extremist points of view on the internet, and AI companions and pornography and things. So it's a very distressing situation, but I think I can tell you, as much as I love my colleagues in computer science, they're not going to be offering solutions to this. It's going to be up to us to do it.
Yeah. And I'll just say very, very briefly, I'll keep this brief, and this is not another screed, but to Victor's point, in Portland, Oregon, where I live, they recently banned all cell phones in public schools. And the effects of this were immediate and they were incredibly positive. When students don't have access to their phones during the school day, their grades get better, their discipline problems go down, and the most interesting statistic that I thought was that use of the school library goes up by about 30-40%. If you take away the addictive, destructive thing that is being forced on them from the outside, you get back the human children that we're all trying to cultivate. It's as simple as it possibly could be.
Which is kind of a game theory, Justin, in terms of setting up a restraint so that focused, concentrated learning can occur. But you're setting up a rule for the game, and it's my sense in my work that technology, particularly something that's as powerful as AI, but this is true of any technology that's ever appeared in human history. Technology moves ahead of our ethical response and our response of restraint. And we have to learn, to get back to Dani's point of failure, we have to fail our way into some kind of more rational restraint. And it sounds to me like, Portland has figured that out, but maybe by trial and error. One of the interesting things about the corporate world, and maybe Dani would comment on this, is that failing is the way we learn, and it is a big part of experimentation. One of my concerns about public governance is that it doesn't fail very well because it doesn't give up things that don't work. Okay. And so also this notion of restraint. How do you restrain culture when it's scaling in the way that we've seen, from 4 billion people in 1970 to 8 billion people today, and 8 billion people that want iPhones and all of the massive accelerating technologies. Okay. But it is about restraint. That's a perfect example of what I mean by game theory and the notion of the challenge of restraint of what really is an unrestrained human condition, which is what is one of the ways of defining, quote, the evil capitalism. But
And Gary, I'm wondering, since we're getting close to our 2 hours, if you could pose this question, and this would be ad hoc, wouldn't be scripted, but we could ask everybody to kind of respond to this. St. Augustine, is brought up, spirituality, all that kind of thing. And I know Justin talked about, was that some of these new technologies are taking us to hell, but then Augustine comes up and, he's based on the teachings of Jesus, and Jesus says that the gates of hell will prevail, so the question is, education itself, particularly higher education, started with the church. And the church was created by Jesus. And of course, Augustine was in many ways the great architect of the church and so forth. So to pose the question, what are some of your thoughts about overcoming the gates of hell that AI can do or not do? I sort of was skeptical about AI for a lot of time, but found it's an amazing tool to do the things I want to do and I think I ought to be doing. It's not just an addiction or distraction, because if people are making an addiction, they haven't really learned how to do it, or they haven't been motivated how to do it. So, not that we want to end up talking about AI per se, but let's just say the new world that is opening up before us. If we could go around and have everybody just give a very quick comment about how you see we might open the door to that new world.
Yes, excellent. Yeah.
So, anybody want to start? I want to make sure I want to get comments from everybody here a bit.
Let's just use the same order that we did to begin the talk. So who spoke first?
Let's not do that because I need you to re-articulate the question.
Oh, there we
Okay.
go.
Okay, I was using metaphorically. So, how do we enter into this new world in terms of what our pedagogies are, what our views of AI, what our understanding of new learning technologies. I mean, learning technologies have been around for 25, 30 years, and they've been evolving. And originally they were very distracting. They were very upsetting to educators. I remember professors saying back in the 80s, well, we'll never use a computer in learning. I mean, in higher education. I remember a professor saying that in a faculty meeting. But the question is, it did. So, and again, we're not talking about technology here. We're talking about learning, and technology is one of those factors. Culture is another factor. How do we form new values? That's why I asked the question earlier about the new form. What new forms of life can we imagine that would, in a sense, stop us from all going to hell? Metaphorically.
So I guess, are we going to go in order or are we just going to go? So,
Let's go for it.
okay.
Go for it.
So it's an incomplete response. I mean, I don't think we know an answer to that question at this point, Carl. But my incomplete response is as we work with students and anybody in any context, we have to promote metacognition. I think and I think Dani had talked about this too. It's not enough just to train people to do things. If let AI do what AI does. Let human beings do what human beings do. And I think that's where we get to the metacognitive aspect of it. And the more we can assist people in understanding how they learn and why they learn, then I think AI will fit into a particular place. But as soon as you take that away, then you run into, I suppose, the open gates of hell, if we're speaking metaphorically, because we've lost our human capacity to intervene in technology in general.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I know earlier I was talking about moving the having a public turn, right? Back in the civil society, civil discourse and things like that. This could also be an opportunity to go inside. Focus now on self-awareness, what Victor was talking about with metacognition, emotional self-control, things like that. It's often called, I use the term intrapersonal empowerment, right? And we can get to know ourselves more since there are so many things that AI is doing out here. We have more time to go inside and cultivate ourselves as people, right? So that's a possibility. That's all I have to say.
Okay, so let's go in the order that we were. So Darryl, you were next, right? I think.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a multifaceted question. There's lots of things one could say about it, but I guess I'll just pick on one aspect of that as a person who creates learning experiences, or tries to. I think I think a pedagogical approach that we could adopt moving forward is, I think competency-based learning is really one of those things that can and probably will become more a key part of education of the future, because a lot of our systems that have been based around people's ability to recall, regurgitate, just they're no longer relevant. But what people can actually do, and what skills and abilities they can actually demonstrate in the real world, is something that you can't mimic with a machine, or you can't fake with a copy paste or plagiarism avoider or anything like that. So I think that's going to be one of the things that's going to help us moving forward from an educational perspective, is being more focused on competencies and real world performance.
Dani? Dani? I'm sorry.
I think we need to remember, like, we keep forgetting that technology is a tool. Like, we don't serve technology, technology serves us, but it feels like more and more we're becoming like in servitude to technology. So I think one is we need to remember that. And then I think the second part is around, and I'm going to go back to what I started this with, and this is these human skills. So metacognition, self-awareness, emotional intelligence. We already know that emotional intelligence trumps IQ when it comes to life success, happiness, all of those things. And I think that's going to play out as AI gets smarter. And I say that in quotes. So I think where we have to really focus now on is how do we help humans develop into humans with self-awareness, with the ability to engage with different kinds of people, to hold competing perspectives, to disagree, but still be able to like shake hands and walk away, or hug and walk away. Those are the skills that I think are going to become more and more. However, I don't think we can develop those skills if we don't go back to the basics of, like, I think teaching people how to read and write, those fundamental skills are always going to be important, even when we get to a place where, we can voice to text now. But to get to that point, we need those foundational, if we walk away from teaching people like basic literacy, I think as a species, we're not going to survive.
Can I just say this? Trivium schools are proliferating right now. Grammar, rhetoric, I think logic, right? Those are coming back, right? So pre-industrial revolution, that's where we need to go.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
Justin?
I quite agree with everything that Erik and Dani said. I think those are absolutely right. And in a certain sense, even though obviously as a writer, I value writing, I think the interest in literacy is really the supervening concern. Whether it's written, whether it's oral, ideally a fully flourishing human being would be able to do both. The only other thing I would add is again, just to try and be really like clear and plain and hopefully not too scoldy, is when I speak about hell in the Augustinian sense, I don't mean it metaphorically. I mean it quite literally. I mean it as an experience of profound apartness that is fabricated and enforced by technology. I think it's deeply, deeply destructive to the individual and collective human experience. And I think that is the thing to be resisted in all circumstances with main force at all costs.
Erik, E-R-I-K?
I think basically what I was thinking a lot about what Justin was saying, and the novel would never have been created without the printing press. So Tom Jones, Henry Fielding, he created a full human being from the print. He was not able to do a novel that thick until the printing press made it available for everybody to distribute novels. So technology and humans have evolved, and art forms have evolved to this point now. And I think this is just another step in the evolution. That's how I see it.
Okay. And Paul?
Yeah, I agree with Erik that it's just another step in the evolution. We should not fear it. We should fear its consequences on, shall we say, a malformed culture, which is most of our culture, malformed people, which sounds like I'm being arrogant, and I don't mean it that way, but is what we see around us a lot. I've followed the phone ban quite interestingly. We've been doing that for 30 years here as a school. Human nature says our students sometimes try to get away with it, right? But we do see a different environment to what Justin was saying. That's probably partly why we have such a really a profoundly good record academically, and yet we accept average students. We're trying to figure out how we engage with AI in our mission. We're not sure, but what I do know is that the students are already engaging with it. And we, I think, would be foolish in our approach if we ignore it. And so we need to come to some kind of grip and then learn OJT, so to speak, as we try and implement certain approaches. I think the most complicated will be implementing it within a given class. And not sure what that's going to look like, but we're going to try and do it.
And Gary, as a sponsor of this enterprise, would you like to make a quick final closing statement?
Gary, you are muted.
Again, I just want to emphasize literacy, and I think the hope side of things is when I'm in my work, I'm talking about this as and it's following Joseph Schumpeter, the human creative, destructive value response, and that covers not just the economy or, for example, AI. When we create something as humans, we're creating value, but that value also has the potential to be destructive, and that's just the natural state of things, meaning natural human nature. So I come away with this being very optimistic, but also very intrigued with Justin's observation from Portland schools that when you pull out the technology, even though it's still there, the kids know they have it. They really focus on human skills that I think Dani was pointing out are so vital, and also Erik Raschke, the idea of community learning and team learning and teamwork and play as opposed to work. Okay, even though it's what I think this was the serio ludere notion of the Neoplatonists, the serious play, right? It's serious, but it's playful. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. This was very engaging and very thought-provoking, and there's a new world coming, and I think we're all in our own way trying to anticipate it. So I appreciate all of you, particularly giving your time and your thought.